Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. The show is all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an appropriate organisational culture. And for those of you who are new to the show, first thing is welcome. Second thing is, what's the format of the show? Well, basically 7 years ago, I started research into the human factor, having worked in governance, risk and compliance. And over those 7 years, I identified a wide range of disciplines which I believe have been significant in helping me rethink the challenges around education awareness. And, how do I raise awareness? How do I influence behaviour? And how do I embed something within an organisational culture? Having identified those disciplines, what we've done here at the show is we've then gone out to find people who are happy to share their insights, either from a research background in those disciplines or from practitioners who specialise in awareness, behaviour and culture. And those people, we bring them up to the show, and then every third or fourth episode, we invite one of our listeners to come on the show and actually share with us what they've learnt from listening to the podcast. So for this show, we've got Susan Weincheck. Susan comes from a background in behavioural science, and it's great to get Susan on the show to build upon the podcast and the interviews that we did, which involved behavioural science in series 1. So without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hello and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. And on the show today, we have a lady whose book I read quite some time ago as part of my initial research. And reading the book, it made sense of a lot of the academics. So I'd read a lot of academic research, which is written in a particular tone and way. But when I read our guest book, it sort of put it in a context that I could understand. It enabled me to get away from the academic and scientific literature that I've been reading. And I think that's a big challenge that we all face in the security industry. Is, how do you actually engage with an audience in a way that they understand? And I think this guest's name is Susan Weincheck. I think she does it perfectly. And I recommend that you go out and get her book, which is called How to Get People to Do Stuff, which there's a phrase that we have over in the United Kingdom called it does what it says on the tin.
It's a good phrase. I haven't heard that.
You've never heard that?
No.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, it was, there's an advert over here in the UK for a company. I'm not sure I should be mentioning their name. But they have this tin and they basically, it does what it says on the tin and everybody gets it. It's like, yeah, that just makes sense. And I think your book is exactly that, which is why it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Susan, and to introduce you to the community that we're building here at Rethinking the Human Factor podcast.
Thanks. I'm glad to be with you.
Oh, that's really good of you. Now, there was something, you've got quite a journey that you've been on. Do you think you could explain to the listeners, what it is you do exactly and the journey that you've been on to get to there?
Well, the work that I do, I have my own company. It's called The Team W, and we do training, workshops, speaking, and consulting in the intersection between behavioral science and technology. So that's pretty broad, and it means we do a lot of things for a lot of different clients. But I have a PhD in psychology, and I have a really long career in going back to when it was called human factors, or actually I go so far back it was called man-machine interaction, and then human factors, and then usability, and then user experience. And when I first started applying what we know about people, how they work, how they think, to the design of technology, that was actually kind of an unusual thing. There weren't a lot of people doing that. And luckily, it has grown a lot since I first got into the field. So it's been an interesting, one of the most interesting things about the journey I've been on, I think, is to go from being someone who's saying, being a speaker at a conference, saying things that just seem really radical and unusual and nobody's thought of, to now, being a speaker that, we know that topic. We had a speaker on that, last year, which is kind of an interesting progression. But it's actually one that makes me happy, because first I was like, oh no, I'm not totally unique. But then I was like, no, this is good. everyone's becoming aware of the fact that the more we understand human behavior and human thinking and human mental processing, the better we will be able to design, product, services, technology to fit the humans rather than working against the humans.
I think you sum it really nicely in the sense, when I first started looking at the challenges we face in the cybersecurity industry around why people do what they do when I've asked them not to, then it seemed to me to make sense that if your objective is to try and influence behavior, you've got to understand how behavior's formed and how it's influenced. And if you didn't understand those factors, then you sort of become subject to them in a sort of controlled way. Now, it's interesting because, I use the phrase uncontrolled. And I know in your book, one of the things that you do make clear is that people or humans do like to have a sense of being in control. Even if they're not in control, the illusion of control is something that reduces anxiety. And so I'm just thinking of your book and I'm going, yes, I like to be in control, don't I? Yeah. So, one of those aha moments, and I'm like, oh yes, control freak. Anyway. But yeah, that sense of you really, if you want to stand a chance of influence behavior, you've got to take the time to step back to actually understand how behaviors are formed and influenced. And obviously, you have done that. And with that,
the research the research in the last 10, 15, 20 years about human behavior and about, all the brain science and neuroscience and behavioral economics and so on. There's really been an enormous amount of work done. And so that has made it, before that, and I'll admit, I have been around long enough that I was around before the recent research explosion. And so before that, we were doing a lot of conjecturing and a lot of theorizing about what was going on. And now we have a lot more information and data. So it has made it easier to then start to apply what we know. And it is kind of this weird, when you think about it, it's kind of this weird thing, right? That we're using our brain and our knowledge to better understand our brain and our knowledge. Right? It's kind of this strange meta thing that we're doing. But I'm fascinated by it. I've been doing it for a long time. I love it. It never gets boring. There's always new research out. There's always new ways to think about the research. And as you mentioned, one of my favorite things to do is to take the research ideas and then explain them and try and apply them in a way that's really practical. You've read a lot of the research, but, a lot of people don't, they're really busy and their job is not reading the research. And so that's one of the roles I like to play, is that bridge between what does the academic research say and then what the heck does that mean and what do we do with it?
Yeah, it's that ability to take that and then to sort of package it in a way that people can understand. And I think it's interesting because the point you were making about, before behavioral economics really came about, and that sort of explosion in that research, across those disciplines, which has resulted in this. I'm not going to use the phrase new thinking because it actually has been around a little bit now. But this explosion in terms of this insight into how we make judgments and decisions, those type of things. Prior to that, it's funny because you look at marketing. I actually trained in the early days. One of the things I trained in was in marketing, and there was all these things that came out from all my training and then the work that I did. And then you look at it and you go, yeah. And I would ask the question, why? Why is that color the one that we're going to choose? Or why are you saying that branding's really important? Or why are you saying that, this comms piece in terms of the tone of voice makes a difference? And I think there was all this like best practice in many ways, that suddenly the science made sense of what the best practice was in many ways, and actually started to draw best practice up to something which was actually proven, and there was data behind it. And it wasn't just this sort of art form, the sense of I've worked in advertising, let's say for 30 years, 40 years, and based upon 40 years experience, I know this type of thing works. I can't tell you exactly how,
Right.
That's my experience. And I think that's what what's happened. And, it's interesting when you, Dan Ariely wrote the book, Predictably Irrational. And I think this is what the science has done. It's turned something from being seen as, well, it's pretty irrational, to now the science is there to start being able to predict within that context of irrationality. And that gives you a degree of certainty. And I think that's what, people like yourself, a number of the guests other guests we've had on the show, but, the broader disciplines that have been developing, I think that's what it's been able to do. It's been able to join the dots so people can see a bit more structure. And it's that structure that gives you a sense of certainty about it. I mean, obviously it's a science and nothing is, I was having a chat with somebody about science and measurement. It's just like, well, it's never perfect, but it's definitely an improvement on where we were, which was, just seeing it as a form of best practice. And now we can explain that. So, completely agree with you on that journey over the last maybe 30, 40 years. So I got a question for you, which is that a lot of the people I've worked with over the last 20 years have invested huge amounts of resource and time into defining the behaviors they expect of employees and contractors and suppliers potentially when it comes to engaging with their sort of information systems and their information. And they usually do this in the form of policies and processes and procedures, which in itself, those three words, it makes it sound incredibly dull in the first place. But they have invested a lot of time and effort into it. And the whole reason why they do that is the goal is to reduce the risk that security incidents are going to happen, and that when they do happen, that you can manage the impact upon that. But there is a sort of recognition that just because you make people aware of what their roles and responsibilities are, that it's not, and in some cases, you actually test people through, CBT or something else. And some cases you get them to a test. So they actually confirm, they sign a contract saying they're going to comply. That's still at the point where people have to take that awareness and then behave in what I call a positive security outcome in a positive way. People still choose not to comply. And I think that's part of what the show about is, why? What is it about people that means that even though they know what's expected of them and they know the consequences and they know the motivating factors behind it, why do people still decide at that given time not to go through with what's expected of them? Have you got any idea?
I do. It's interesting. I had this conversation, a similar conversation recently with a client who was a very large company who was very interested in reducing risk. I asked a similar question, and they didn't like my answer. I could tell, because there isn't just one answer. And so, people don't make decisions and they don't act in what we would consider logical ways. There are a lot of factors that go into why someone does what they do at a certain moment. So, for instance, the self-story they have. So it's possible, you've trained them, whether consciously or unconsciously, and a lot of this happens unconsciously, they may be thinking something like, I know that that's the procedure, but I have a lot of experience. I am an expert, or I've been doing this a long time. I may consciously or unconsciously, and understanding that a lot of this happens unconsciously, I may decide that my ideas of how to react to the situation are better than your ideas and the training you gave me.
Right.
And I may not even realize I'm doing that, right? So the thing is that a lot of our behavior is unconscious. A lot of it is driven by self-stories. And that may or may not work with the procedures and processes that you have put into place.
Okay. So stories that we tell ourselves, are they stories that we tell ourselves to justify our behavior? Is that right?
Well, that's partially right. Yes. So definitely we use our self-stories to justify our behavior, but they go much deeper than that. It's not just to justify our behavior. It really is describing to ourselves and to other people who we are and what's important to us and our own histories and our backgrounds and why we do what we do. And they really drive our behavior. And I think that a lot of times when you've got an organization that's trying to deal with, security and risk, they don't take into account the individual self-stories. And it's really a problem because you can't write a procedure that just automatically takes that into account for the 100,000 people you have working in plants worldwide. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not. It's like, I don't like that answer. I don't want to deal. Right? This is not. That's too complicated.
Yeah.
Just help me write a procedure and help me figure out how to get people to follow it, regardless of all that. But you can't. All that is important. My business partner, who is an economist, so he's on the behavioral economic side. He and I put together an equation.
Okay.
We call it the behavioral design model.
Right.
And I'll say the equation and then I'll explain it because he's very mathematical. He likes that there's an equation. I'm like, okay, people don't like math. Let's just say what it is. But anyway, so we sound smart. Here's the equation. Okay. Yeah. QBD equals KH plus KS plus P. So you got that, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I've written it down. I don't know what it means.
You're saying the quality of the behavioral design that you're trying to implement. That's the QBD.
Yeah.
Equals, it's made up of the following: the knowledge that you have about the humans whose behavior you're trying to change. How much do you know about this particular group of people? Mm-hmm. Plus the knowledge of the situation.
Yeah.
Because there's context that always affects behavior, relationships between people, power differentials, or the corporate culture. There's so much going on that affects how people are reacting to what you're trying to teach them to do or get them to do. And then P is process, which is we believe that not the process and procedure that you go through, but the process you go through to change behavior. So all those things are important. And if you're missing one of those pieces, you're not going to get the behavior you're expecting to get.
Yeah. And I was in your experience, I mean, essentially you were talking about the client that you're speaking to, and they're sort of coming back and then going, "Yeah, I just want to write a process."
Right.
And a lot of people look at this and then they go, "It's funny actually. There's something going on here," because a lot of people, they don't even look at what you're suggesting; they just hear it and think that sounds complicated. And that's going to, I just want to write a process. I don't want to overthink. That's it. I don't want to overthink this. Okay. And then you get to this point where you're going, okay, well, you end up with a process, but does it result in the outcomes that you're looking for? Or does it actually result in people just looking at it and finding a different way of going about doing their business?
Right.
And then it's, so actually when you look at, the points that you're raising there, knowledge of humans is almost a sense of, when you talk about knowledge of humans, are you talking about knowledge of how people make decisions or knowledge about how people receive information? In your book, I think it's interesting, that you do highlight the relationship between, the brain as the processing element, if you want to think of it that way, is dependent upon energy at the end of the day. And I think it's interesting that, if your body has not, if you're asking your brain to do a lot of cognitive thinking and it's right at the end of the day and you've barely got any energy left after a full day and maybe you're under a lot of stress within the working environment, the point that you're sort of making, the brain isn't able to perform so well. So is there this, when it comes to the part of the formula you're talking about knowledge of humans, is it about your knowledge of how people process information, or is it like market research, your knowledge of the audience that you're communicating with, which I know is something that you've raised as well?
It's both. I mean, it's definitely the knowledge of how people make decisions. I mean, the research on decision making is so much fun. Like, for instance, There's a part of the brain that makes what's called value or goal-directed decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Like logical thinking. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I buy this? Should I buy that? Should I follow this procedure? Should I follow that procedure? Which would be the best one in this situation, right? That's value-based, goal-directed thinking. And that happens in one part of the brain. And there's a different part of the brain that does habit-based decisions, automatic habit decisions.
Yep.
And what we now know is that those two parts of the brain aren't active, can't be active at the same time.
Okay, right, yeah.
So when you've activated one, the other one gets quiet.
Okay.
And vice versa, which means, for instance, let's say you have trained people so that when a certain situation happens, you want them to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, to shut down a piece of machinery, to take away, risk, and so on, right? Yep. You have a safety procedure you want them to follow. If you want them to do that, one of the things you have to do, everyone knows this, they have to practice it over and over and over and over and over and over, right? So that when that situation happens, it's automatic and they just do it.
Yeah.
And that, therefore, is a habit. If you've had them practice enough, it's a habit.
Yeah.
But if in that situation, when it really occurs in real life, there's a bunch of information that they have to evaluate first. They're not in habit mode.
Yeah.
So the habit's not going to kick in. It's not going to work, right? Because you have them thinking and evaluating and looking at the data. That's not habit. And their brains literally can't get that habit response triggered, And so this is the kind of knowledge we need to know this stuff about people if we're trying to devise systems to get them to act in a certain way.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting because you've sort of hit on, I think, a challenge that we face within the industry, which is a sense of, there's this mantra about, repeat, repeat, repeat. And the whole idea of building a habit. And sometimes I do ask myself the question, is it a habit we want, or do we want people to give some thinking? And I think you just sort of drawn the line nicely between there, because you can get somebody in a habit, but there's got to be a trigger element before the habit kicks in. And you're like, okay, but the trigger then is based upon maybe some conscious thinking.
Right. So there's a problem.
There's the problem. And you look at how people then maybe train people. For me, training, you mentioned here, knowledge of the situation, and you're talking about the environment. What's your view upon, I train somebody to develop a habit in a lab, at their desk, with some CBT or, whatever the technique is, but you're almost taking them out of real life and you're putting them into this sort of alternative reality, which is the training sense,
Right.
And you train them in that environment and they learn in that environment. Let's make the assumption that they learn in that environment. They learn to think about something. Let's say then somehow they get past the physical things that we were just talking about, so conscious things, and they actually then start to develop a habit. But when you put them into the actual real environment, the situations where they're suddenly going to come across this particular threat, for example, are they going to, is that learning approach not necessarily flawed, but not as effective as it could be because of the fact that you're learning in one environment and actually reality is that you're going to be in a different environment?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the environment, the situation, the context is critical. I mean, even to the point of, the lighting, the sound, the other people around you, the room you're in.
Yeah.
So especially if we're talking about, critical incidents, what you've done essentially is trained them to react at their desk.
Yeah.
But if that's not the real environment, and maybe that is, I mean, it's possible. If you're talking about cybersecurity, it might be that they are at their desk and they see something come up. I mean, so that might be appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if it's not, then those cues are critical. And so the habit you think you've built in is not built the way you think.
Mm.
So going back to your formula, knowledge of situation, and you mentioned there, the environment within which people make choices. Now, this is something that I've been sort of banging the drum for the last 5-6 years within the industry about, is that the concept of choice architecture.
Mm.
Could you just explain what the concept of choice architecture is and how that relates to how you better design just the actual environment to bring around, the behavioural outcomes that you're looking for, ideally?
Yeah, I mean, choice architecture, it's a great term, and I think it's a great concept, and it has to do with designing stuff, whether that be the situation, the context, a physical product, a digital product, designing things so that the choice you want people to make is the easy, obvious choice. And so that actually maybe they don't even need to make a choice at all. Maybe it's the opposite of choosing. So an example is always given, has to do with, for instance, organ donation.
Mm-hmm.
And in the countries where, like in the U.S., where when you die, your organs are donated, requires you to have checked a box on your driver's license form.
Yep.
And so you have to take an action, which is check this tiny box on a driver's license form when all you're trying to do is get your driver's license.
Yep.
So the probability that someone is going to do that is much lower, right, than in the countries where the box is automatically checked.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want to donate your organs, then you have to uncheck the box. And guess what? Very few people uncheck the box, just like very few people check the box in the U.S.
Yeah.
So, the idea is you architect this, you design this so that the behavior you're hoping people will do, which is donate organs, it almost becomes not a behavior, I don't have to do anything and I've donated my organs. So, that's an extreme case, but and so the design might not be quite that obvious, but that's the idea behind it. We just make it so easy that people have to do nothing or very little.
Mm-hmm.
And, people are by nature, I say it this way, it's possibly dramatic, but they're by nature very lazy. And that's good.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. Because if we had to expend a lot of energy to do everything, we couldn't survive.
Yeah.
We need glucose in our brains for our brains to work and so on. So it's adaptive to just do stuff without thinking about it.
And I think that point, it's difficult, isn't it? When you say, when you have to sort of say, and people are generally lazy, and there's part of you just thinks, I don't want to say that because it sounds so negative. But on this show, the number of times that I have to skirt around that particular issue is amazing. But I think in reality, people know. Humans are, they find the course of least resistance might be one way of putting it.
There you go. Such a nicer way of saying it.
But actually, when you get to the roots of it, and the point you were making there, the brain requires energy, and that's glucose, and there's only so much in your body, and it varies at different times of the day. But if you go back even to our evolutionary past, and we interviewed a guy called Kieran on the podcast, and he come from a psychology background like yourself, but he done a lot of work into really old technology. So not the stuff that surrounds us, the shiny stuff that we see nowadays, but older forms of technology and how people interacted there. And one of the things he was talking about is it's just this evolutionary process that we have. The body is designed to make the most of what it's got. And if that means we try to do too much and our glucose levels are down, then the brain can't really do what it needs to do to survive, because that's really what the brain's about. It's there to survive. And so the brain evolution naturally means that we're going to try and find that course of least resistance or least effort. And, quite frankly, that's just about us being lazy. We've got this thing about lazy being a negative word, and it's just like, which is a cultural thing, which brings me on to my next point, the role of culture. Often when I talk to people about culture, they see culture, it's just so big that it's almost like, let's not think about it. Let's just focus on making people aware and trying to drive behavior. But can you actually make any gains around behavior without taking into consideration the broader cultural context?
Well, you can make some gains, but chances are you'll guess incorrectly about how to go about doing something because you'll be missing this big piece, right? So when I talk about, the KS, the knowledge of the situation, that does include culture, and culture can be very broad or it can be quite narrow, right? So we can talk about the culture in terms of the culture of that country or that part of the world, but we can also talk about the culture of a region. We can talk about a corporate culture, which we find is just such a huge factor in human behavior.
Yeah.
And so often we're talking about human behavior in the workplace, and yet we're unwilling to delve into what the heck is going on in the corporate culture. And, if you look at the corporate culture, is there trust? Is there power differential? And this can go all the way, you can get really granular and go down to a particular team, right? And the dysfunctions within a team and the effect that is having on behavior. I don't think you can ignore that if you want people to do something. And this is, but people want to ignore it because, what's interesting is no matter what we do, we cannot get away from the general messiness of humans and human relationships. And, we think, well, we're talking about, safety and risk and cybersecurity and, and we're not talking about, relationships, but of course you are. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about people at the end of the day. Risk is by very nature is.
And as
human.
Weird as we are at home, we bring that right into the workplace with us,
Yep, absolutely. And I'm sure sometimes it gets amplified.
Right.
Yeah, but it gets amplified because of, the environment. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, you've raised the question of trust. I think trust is really, really important. And I think it's one of the reasons behind why I set out on this journey around rethinking the human factor is that, it's quite widely recognized that the level of trust between employee and employer has been on a downhill slope for quite some time. And, in my line of work, that one of the things I have reservations about is that it could be tempting to try to get employees to comply with policy and process and procedures or to drive behavioral change by introducing more and more technology to monitor. And I just don't think that helps build that trust culture. And I come across it with organizations where people do talk about it. They say, look, this is the challenge. How far do we monitor people to make sure that our policies are being complied with? And I think the work of, taking an approach which is more behavioral focused, leveraging sort of the disciplines that you've been talking about, that I talk about, that other guests are talking about. It's really about giving people the best possible chance of making a good decision. And so, when you mentioned trust, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that's something that maybe on this show we haven't really reflected upon that much, is that things are going in the wrong direction generally. Some places there's good trust, a lot of places there isn't. And my concern is that if we put more and more technology in to monitor people, we erode that trust still further.
One of the things I think we underutilize is the power of social norms and the power of a group to actually self-regulate. There's some really great research on the fact that when you bring a group of people together, let's say you have a work team, right? The team, under the right conditions, will regulate itself quite tightly, probably more tightly than, corporate governance would.
Yeah.
The team, it's pretty interesting. A small group of humans, they won't let the individuals get out of line if they have the power to regulate that. And that's better done in a relatively small team. But if the corporate office, which is, 500 miles away, is the one that's supposedly regulating the team and regulating teams and regulating thousands or tens of thousands of people, that's not nearly as effective as a team of 10 or 20 or 50 regulating themselves.
So I guess this brings it, the whole concept of social norm, and then even just the word norm, and from a culture perspective, when you look at what a definition of culture is, it's often, common phrase would be the way things are done around here, but actually that is the way things are normally done around here, and it's about values and and how things are done normally. Those norms, if somebody tells you this is the norm, this is what's expected of us, and it comes from a head office environment, as often is the case with cybersecurity, often it's a head office function, and then the rules get pushed out, so to speak, and they end up in smaller offices where there's much smaller teams. What is it that the people designing those campaigns need to be thinking about to increase the odds that those people out in the remote offices are actually going to choose to comply?
Well, the answer has to do with reframing the question.
Okay.
Because you have to have buy-in. So the local team needs to believe that is the norm for their team.
Yeah.
And if the only way they're going to believe that is because someone somewhere else told them that's the norm, that's unlikely to be very powerful. They have to decide that is the norm for them because there's evidence that works for them, and or because they were involved in putting it together. So just to say, here you go, here's your norm, that's not a norm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because we sort of like talking about endowment there, the sense of somebody's built something, or I've heard it called, the IKEA effect, where you take pride and a sense of value in something that you've built. And some people overvalue what they build as well. But that sense of you've been part of the, agreeing what that procedure is going to be and the documenting of it. Could you get endowment from knowing that actually your team has been consulted, but not necessarily you?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the teams are very powerful. And if people really want to be part of a team, and the whole social, we are social animals. A lot of what we do is driven by wanting to be part of a group. So if I do feel I'm part of the team and the team has decided to do X, Y, and Z, even if I wasn't part of that decision, much higher chance that I'm going to go along with it if I feel that I am part of the team.
Yeah. So this is interesting because often I think policies and processes and procedures get designed almost in isolation.
Yeah, definitely.
And the process of the horrible phrase is like socializing, a draft. So here's draft zero,
right.
draft 0.1. It's been designed in this part of the business, and they then socialize it amongst the key stakeholders, and the key stakeholders get it, and it comes back, and there's more comments around the grammar and the punctuation than there are about the actual real content. The sense of that review process, is that endowment? I mean, some people would say to me, well, yeah, the people are, obviously the business has considered it, they reflected upon it, and they've decided to sign off the policy. And then the question I put to people is, should they be involved in writing the policy in the first place, not just reviewing it? Because to me, writing it and reviewing it are two separate things, and what you get from writing and developing something is different from what you get from reviewing it. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, if you're reviewing it, it is not the same as if you were in on the writing and developing of it. And another thing that comes into play that I think people don't realize. Do you know Robin Dunbar's work with small group, large group?
No, I don't.
what's called strong teams and weak teams.
Okay.
And weak has a certain anthropological definition that's not what we usually think of. So Robin Dunbar is I think he's in the UK. He's an anthropologist.
Okay.
And there are mathematical models which will tell you for different species in the animal kingdom what the ideal group size is for that species. So, what's the ideal group size for elephants or tigers or
Facebook,
baboons, or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
What's the size of group that they tend to be, and what's the size where if it's less than that they don't survive, and if it's more than that they get too competitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Robin Dunbar, I don't know if he's the one that came up with there's a formula that is actually related to the size of the brain.
Okay.
The volume of the brain. And so what he did was he applied that formula to humans to see what's the ideal size for humans.
Okay.
And he came up with 148 as the maximum size.
I know that number. I've heard of that number. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So we rounded up to, it's called Dunbar's number. And we rounded up to 150, 148, 150. And that's called a strong tie versus weak tie. So the 150 means that that's the number of people that you can, if you can know all 150 people. You can know who they are. You recognize their face. You know their name. You know the relationships between them.
Yeah.
And typically these are people in physical proximity. So we're still, I think, having to find out what are the boundaries of that, because in anthropology it had to do with animals physically living together in community. Mm-hmm. And maybe that can be stretched. But then the idea is that outside of that number, then other people is part of what's called a weak tie community. Now, not weak as in bad and ineffectual, just different. It's a different type of community when it's bigger than that. Mm-hmm. And you do things with your strong tie community that you don't do with your weak tie. And I think we don't realize how important that number can be. And so when we're trying to, like you said, how many people can come together and work on it and review it and so on, if you're talking about influencing behavior of more than 150 people, you probably already have a problem if you haven't, who have you been involving? You've at least got to get, one of the, so if I have my team over here in my plant or my department or my, location of a company, and we got 150 people over here, I have to have at least some of them involved in this whole process that maybe they can come back and say, okay, I told them. We told them how important it is to do da-da-da-da, right? And so at least there's that connection. Otherwise, you've got these strong tie communities that are doing their own thing. You've got to involve them.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, by the way, about a weak tie community, for instance, some of the research I think is interesting is if you're looking for a new job. Here's a quiz question for you, Bruce.
Okay. Do I get any prizes? I'm about to say, do I get a prize, which is going to be my next question about rewards?
No,
but let's carry on.
because we're going to work on desire for mastery and not rewards.
Okay.
So if you were looking for a new job, mm-hmm. a new employment, should you tap your strong tie community or your weak tie community?
I think I would tap if weak correlates to a smaller number of people, I'd probably go for a smaller.
Strong tie is your small number of people. That's your 150. Okay. A weak tie community is the other thousands of people you know and have some connection with, but they're not part of your strong tie community.
I would think I would have gone for my strong tie community. This is where I get completely disproved. Oh no.
No, actually, it should be your weak tie community.
Okay.
And the reason is that your strong tie community is too close to you, and whatever they know, you already know. Whatever connections they have, you already have. And if you want to get a new job, you need new connections.
Right. Okay.
And so you need to reach out into that weak tie community to get some new ideas, new blood, new direction.
Okay. Very interesting.
Anyway, I just think that the strong tie, weak tie idea is so interesting and important. And I think a lot of times we don't take that into account when we're making these process decisions.
Yeah. It's interesting because often when I speak to people in my industry who are in that position where they're working within an organization and they've got to come up with a policy, it's almost a sense of it's easier for the other stakeholder to say, you write the policy and then bring it to us and we'll review it, because it saves them time. So it seems like it's easier to them, but actually it undermines the end product. And I like to see security as a product. And the idea is, we get people, if you design it properly, when people engage with it, they'll enjoy engaging with it and they'll want to come back for more. And it's sort of getting down to that design process that if people don't want to get involved in the design at the early stages because they think it's going to save them time, actually what they end up developing is something which is not really going to be that sticky.
Right.
And part of what we've got to do in terms of, if we genuinely want to influence behavior is we've got to get people involved as early as possible and get them involved in developing the product so that there is a sense of it's something that they've built. And in taking that into consideration, then things like the Dunbar's number, I think might very well have a role to play in terms of understanding when and where we need to be applying that as well.
I think the other thing is that the amount of interaction that people need in order to feel that they were involved is probably a lot less than you think.
Oh, that's interesting, because most people would assume that, the people at the other side who you're now asking to engage would be thinking about, they're immediately thinking it's loss aversion. It's a case of, okay, so how much time have I got to sink into this project and how that can have an impact upon my productivity against the things that I'm being measured against? So if you think that, what makes you think that it isn't as much as what probably imagine? I imagine there's a bias at play here. Yeah.
Right. So the important things are that you come to me early. Mm-hmm. Like you don't bring me a draft.
Yep.
Because that's not early.
Yeah.
You come to me before you've written anything, and you interview me and you listen to me so that I feel that I have been listened to.
Yeah.
All right. So now we've got that level of relationship. We've got that level of trust.
Yeah.
And I can say to myself and to other people, I told them what was important. They listened to me.
Yeah.
Right. And then you need to come back to them with something, again, not a full draft, but a something in which you say, now, is this what you meant?
Yeah.
And they go, yes, that is what I meant. Now now you've got that investment.
Yes.
So then when the thing comes out and it's got all this other stuff in it, but it has the two things he mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, see, it's in there. They did what I told them to do. They did 47,000 other things, but that doesn't matter because they listened to me. I influenced this design. I influenced this product. So it might not be, and the person who needs that in order to feel, that IKEA effect, right? That because I built it, it's now mine. Mm-hmm. They don't want to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
If you ask, if you said we'd like you to be on the committee and come to all the meetings, they'd be like, what? Yeah. But there's enough of that of involvement that they feel the ownership.
They feel ownership. Yeah. I think it's interesting because we're talking about behavior at the design stage, in terms of designing the policy, the process, and the procedure. Where often what I see in everyday practice is that the behavioral aspect is in terms of we're going to communicate to people what it is we want them to do. And it's really relying upon internal comms and training. Whereas the common ground, I think, between ourselves is that actually it's the design process right at the beginning. The comms and the training bit is only part of the equation. You've got to design something that people feel they are part ownership own.
Right.
You can make the most slick video. You can have the greatest CBT. Okay. Right. But if the product, so to speak, isn't a product that the customer, the internal customer wants, they're not going to buy it, are they?
No.
Yeah. Or if they do buy it, their whole experience of it is going to be one that is going to mean that they're not going to want to buy it again. Okay. So we touched on something. This I've been asking a lot of my my guests about this one. The issue of motivations behind why people engage with any campaign that you might be doing. If you're going to do sort of doing a marketing campaign around policy, processes, procedures, an internal comms campaign, or even CBT. And there's a lot going on within our industry at the moment about gamification.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot about, I've worked with some organizations where a significant, by significant, I mean, maybe 25, 30% of their budget is going upon buying stuff to act as prizes for people to engage with the campaign. That's just to engage with it,
Right.
and then maybe some quizzes, and then, people that participate, the select winners. I really want to get your views on this because, I talk to people and I've done my research, and I think sometimes people look at me and go, yeah, but Bruce, you're not a behavioral psychologist. Okay. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I've just spent 6 years taking time out to sit down and listen to behavioral psychologists and read what they're reading and try and, make sense of it. I said, but this is the reason why, we've got people like you on the show, because this is what you do. Okay. Do rewards work?
Yes, in some situations.
Okay. Right.
Rewards. So since you read the book, How to Get People to Do Stuff, you know that I talk about 7 drivers of motivation, and rewards is one of them. And I say in the book that they can work very well, but in certain situations and with certain people. And one of the main problems with rewards is that they actually work against other more powerful types of motivation. So you can really screw things up by applying a reward. So, for example, one of the biggest drivers of motivation often is, and all of these depend, it just depends on the person and the situation. But a really big driver of motivation is the desire for mastery, is the desire to learn more, to grow more, to test one's skills and knowledge. Mm-hmm. And people will work really hard if they feel that they're growing and that they're getting better at something. And if you introduce a reward into that, the research shows that the desire for mastery is suppressed when rewards are given.
Right.
And so one of the main problems with gamification, true people who really understand gamification base it on the desire for mastery, base it on and the way you do that is you give people control and autonomy. You give people feedback on how much they've progressed and how far they have to go to the next level, to get to the next level. Mm-hmm. And you have the right amount of difficulty. If it's too hard, they give up. If it's too easy, it's boring. So the level of difficulty is important. And that's what spurs on the desire for mastery. If you introduce a reward into that, the desire for mastery will just start to evaporate. And now they're just doing it with rewards. And the problem with rewards is as soon as you stop giving the reward, the behavior stops. So now, it's like you gave me a reward to try this and I tried it and then the reward went away and now I'm not going to use it anymore because I'm not getting the reward. So rewards work really, really well when you are they do work well when you're trying to get people to do something for the first time,
right?
Or they work really well in terms of getting people to gamble. Very effective. Variable rewards where they win sometimes, but then not others. Yep. They also work very well with dogs and small children. So that's what I always say is really good with dogs, really good with toddlers. Just ask my children who I experimented on when they were young.
Yeah.
But you've got to, you got to be really, really careful because, if you rely on them, you're either going to mess it up totally or, at worst, just not get the results you want.
So is this in the book, this is where you talk about contingency, the difference between them, this sense of contingency. So can you explain what you mean by contingency for the listeners? Is it in my head, I'm thinking, participation is contingent upon actually getting a reward. Is that how we're seeing this?
Yes. Contingency means if you don't get a reward, then you'll stop doing it.
Right.
So, in some of the research, for instance, they would have children play with certain toys or, use markers or pens to draw pictures. And if their use of those was contingent upon a reward, so if you played with the pens, then you got a reward, then they would find that once they stopped giving the rewards, the kids stopped doing the drawing.
Yeah.
They wouldn't draw anymore. But if a reward was given, but not for playing with that toy, if just, rewards were randomly given, and it was not contingent upon playing with a particular toy, then that may, that was kind of okay. Right? Yeah. And they would still keep playing with the pens. But the problem is when you tie the two together. I mean, people are very, rewards. See, here's the interesting thing. Rewards are so powerful that they create a problem.
Okay. Too much of something is too much of a good thing type of thing.
Yeah, we quickly learn, that's why variable, and Skinner, who came up with the science behind this, and he did a lot of amazing research. And, he showed that, for instance, variable ratio reward schedule is really powerful. And that's a reward schedule where you get a reward, but not all the time. Yeah. And you don't know when the next reward is coming.
Yeah.
And that's, for instance, playing slot machines. That's what a slot machine is. And casinos know this, right? And they use a combination of reward, which is operant conditioning, along with classical conditioning, like lights flashing and so on. And classical conditioning also very powerful. That's why whenever your cell phone makes a buzz or a beep, you have to reach out and pick it up and look at it. I mean, that's the whole science behind habits.
Yeah.
So the stuff is very, very powerful. But we also know that if you give a reward every time, which Skinner would call continuous reinforcement, it stops working. Because why should I? And if you ever, do you have any dogs?
No, but the neighbors have just moved in and they've got one.
So if you've ever trained a dog,
you
train them, you want them to walk nicely next to you when you're going for a walk and not like pull ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So whenever what you do is that I don't have a dog, but my daughter does. And I was dog sitting for her once. She was on a trip out west and I had the dog for a week, and the dog was notoriously bad at, it would do this. You'd take it for a walk and it would just be pulling, right? It would like drive you crazy, hurt your shoulder.
Yep.
And so it's like, okay, I have the dog for a week. I'm going to train this dog. So after one day, I took a video while we were out walking and I texted it to her and she's like, how did you do that? Well, the thing is, if you give the dog, right, so you catch the dog when it's not pulling because, whatever, it's tired or something. And then as soon as it's not pulling, you stop and give a little treat, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And then the dog, dogs are pretty smart, very quickly learns, if I walk nicely and don't pull, I'm getting this yummy treat.
Right? Yes.
But if you keep giving the dog the reward, it'll start pulling again. It's like, well, I know whenever I want a piece of food, I'll just stop pulling and I'll get it. So you can't do continuous rewards. It's got to be variable. The dog doesn't know. Am I going to get a treat now? No, maybe not. Okay, I'll just never pull because that optimizes how often I get a treat.
And does that tie in any way with inquisitiveness? I mean, the sense of within the book, for example, you talk about novelty and the need to sort of, how novelty and new stuff actually releases dopamine, which is something which is like a pleasure hormone, isn't it? It makes you feel good. That inquisitiveness, is that how it works? The sense of, I'm going to get this, aren't I? And you're on your edge and you're wondering whether or not you're going to get a reward for doing it.
Well, okay. So you mentioned dopamine, and dopamine now we know is not released. It's not really directly related to pleasure. It's directly related to anticipation.
Uh-huh.
And Robert Sapolsky has done this amazing, wonderful research on this. And so when what happens is I anticipate that I might get a reward. And that anticipation releases dopamine.
Yep.
And dopamine makes me take action.
Right.
So it is the anticipation of the reward that is actually driving the behavior, not the reward itself.
Yeah. Yes, and that's where then it fits in nicely with this, this randomized approach, which is it is about the anticipation. It's not about the reward. The reward doesn't even have to be that big, does it? I mean, for the dog, it's going to be. And
Sapolsky shows that when the anticipation, when the reward is given every time, the behavior drops. I mean, he shows that the dopamine drops and the behavior drops. And when the animal can't predict whether this particular instance is going to result in a reward, that is the most dopamine that's released and then the most action taken.
Okay.
Isn't behavioral science fun?
I love it. This was when I started picking up all these books. I mean, actually, we've had to put in new shelves in my office. Okay. Right. Well, I'm going to go because I have just heard the front door close, and that means any minute now, those kids are kind of running up the stairs, and I'm going to be rolled over.
All right,
Susan.
Great to talk to you. Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
You take care. Bye. Hi there. Well, I hope you found that conversation with Susan really interesting. I did. I knew I would. Conversations I've had with her before just inspired me. And how quickly she got back when I actually reached out to her to say, look, would you be happy to come and share insights with our listeners on the show? She just bit my hand off. It was absolutely fantastic to get that sort of response from people who see the challenges that we face within the security community and want to be of some support in terms of, helping us rethink the human factor. So if you enjoyed the show, and I hope you did, how can you best be kept informed of the new podcasts as they come out? Well, probably the best way to do that is to actually join us on LinkedIn at the Rethinking the Human Factor group. The group is there specifically to continue the conversations that we're having here on the podcast, but also the foundations that we set with the Rethinking the Human Factor book. And as part of that group, we're going to be running a series of webinars and also providing some unique content to our members to help them sort of continue that journey of rethinking the human factor, which is very much what we're all about. So yeah, if you want to stay abreast of what the new podcasts are going to be and when they've been published, then a great way to do that will be at the LinkedIn group for Rethinking the Human Factor. If you're not a member of LinkedIn, don't worry. There are other ways of staying in contact with what we're up to here. First way that you can do that is if you actually visit the www.marmaladebox.com website. And at marmaladebox.com, you can register to actually be kept informed of all the work that we're doing around awareness, behavior, and culture, including the podcast. That's one way that you can do that. The other way you can do it is if you're actually downloading from, for example, iTunes, you can add it to you can add the RSS feed, and basically every time a new podcast comes out, it automatically downloads. So that's another option for you. One of the things that we're really interested in doing is trying to get more input from our listeners. So if you've got any questions that you want me to put towards any of our guests over the coming series, we're really, really happy to receive those questions. So probably the best way for you to do that is to drop me an email at podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. That's right. That's podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com.
Okay, so what's the next podcast all about? Well, the next podcast is actually with a lady by the name of Stella Collins. Stella's career has actually winded through IT service delivery, security, and even an element of security training. She's really quite interested in cybersecurity, but actually having the discussions that I've been having with the first opportunity to really think it through in relation to what she really does now. What she does now is help develop learning and development programs. Now, Stella has a real interest in terms of the neuroscience, the behavioral science impact in terms of design upon L&D. And so she was a natural fit within the show to actually try and bring somebody on who can talk about bits and pieces of what we've been talking about over series 1 and will continue over series 2 and how that might shape an L&D program. Absolutely fantastic conversation with her. Some uncomfortable truths in there. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but, Stella really blows apart some of the assumptions that we all naturally make, okay, when it comes to, learning techniques. And so if you're interested in the uncomfortable truths, I recommend that you do register with us so that you become a member of the LinkedIn group so you know when the next podcast is coming along. On a final note, if you're not aware of it yet, there is a book that accompanies this podcast series. That book is called Rethinking the Human Factor. And if you can get that book, it's a low investment, short read, not going to take a lot of your time. But what we found is that it's really acting as a great platform for the reader to be able to sit back and rethink the human factor based upon a relatively small number of insights that you find within the book. And if you find that book interesting, you can combine that with what's going on here at the podcast. And I hope that this really helps you start on that journey of rethinking the human factor. Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us on the show. It's been great to have you here, and I hope to have you here at the next episode too. Cheerio.